Welcome, everybody. On behalf of Holocaust Museum LA, my name is Michael Morgenstern, and I work with our education department at the museum. This afternoon, you have the honor and privilege of listening to Stephen Caveri, a Holocaust survivor from Hungary, who will share his story with you. Before we begin, I want to just share a few quick words about the museum. Holocaust Museum LA was founded in the early 1960s by a group of Holocaust survivors who wanted to make sure this history would never be forgotten. They did this at a time when most people were not yet ready to face this tragic history. Thanks to their courage and foresight, we have a museum with a mission always to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. Part of our mission is sharing the stories of Holocaust survivors in our community, and we're honored this afternoon to have Stephen Caveri with us, who will share his story, and afterwards you can ask him questions and we'll answer as many as possible. Those watching on Zoom can use the Q&A box. Those watching on Facebook can use the comments. Stephen has been speaking at our museum for a couple of years now, and we're so happy to have him as a part of our community, speaking to students on a regular basis and participating in our educational programs. And we cannot do what we do, our mission of commemoration, education, and inspiration, without our volunteers like Stephen, who comes here to share his story with us virtually and hopefully in person in the near future. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon and for sharing your story. And you may begin.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Stephen Caveri, and I was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1941. And my luck would have it, I got involved with the Holocaust at about age 4. And I was a happy little camper growing up, a normal childhood. My parents were relatively comfortable, borderline wealthy, maybe not so borderline. On my father's side, we had a chain of shoes and accessory stores, namely a women's fashion shoes and accessories throughout besides Budapest, some other Eastern European cities like Zagreb, Prague, etc. On my mother's side, the family was during the Holocaust when it happened. They were in what's today Slovakia, in a fairly small town called Piešťany is where they lived, and where they had an appliance manufacturing business. Just a recent visit to Budapest, I went through a restaurant of actually a client of mine who has a branch in Budapest. And I was looking at one of the ranges, and lo and behold, it bore the name Balcony, which was the brand name that my grandparents established. Just as a sad statistic, just want to mention that out of my mother's side, she was one of 8 sisters, and 2 sisters lived in the United States at the time of the Holocaust. One was living with the grandparents, who managed to, I mean, one of the sisters managed to escape, but the other four sisters, or five sisters, I'm sorry, my math, they all perished along with my grandparents who lived in Slovakia. So that's to give you a little background. Michael, maybe can bring up the PowerPoint, if you will. Yeah, so next frame is just to give you a little visual. This is my mom and dad right after the war. My dad was a fairly chubby fella, and this suit doesn't seem to fit him too well. He unfortunately suffered irreversibly during the war. He had two tours of forced labor, one in Romania and one in Sopron, Hungary, along with my mother, who was also in forced labor in Sopron, Hungary. My story, my Holocaust story, really starts with the Sopron story. In about August of 1944, I mean, there was a little bit of a, how should I say, rocky road when my father, for the first time, went to forced labor in late 1943. Somehow he managed to return around June of 1944, but then they were again conscripted and forced to report to forced labor in about September of 1944, at which time, just preceding it, they took me to what's considered a safe house, and I'm going to elaborate on the safe house concept later in my talk to you. So they dropped me off and then went on their way, and they ended up in Sopron until about April of 1945 is when they made their return. I was in the safe house. I didn't know anybody. I was a little kid, 4 years old, not quite, or just about. And I was, luckily for me, I was assigned to a teenager named Piroshka, who looked after me. Piroshka in English translates to Goldilocks. That may sound a little humorous, but in Hungarian, it's actually a fairly common name. So she looked out after me, and I don't remember a whole lot during this time, being a 4-year-old, not even quite at that time. But I do remember that approximately in early February of 1945, my grandfather showed up and took me out from the care of Piroshka and the children's safe house, and took me back to their residence, which was on Akacva Street, which was smack in the middle of the ghetto. But by then the ghetto, because of the bombings, was pretty well porous. So going in and out of the ghetto was no great feat. And that's where I spent the month of February and March with my grandparents. There were a number of air raids, which we spent in the bunker in the basement. And actually they had a hiding place, and that's how they survived. which was camouflaged um, by kindling wood and wood that was burned in the heaters, wood burning heaters of their apartment. And so they had a cavity behind this camouflage, and that's how they were able to survive the raids that were the periodic raids by the Aerocross and the gendarmerie of Budapest. We call them the cock-feathered, kakastolash, the cock-feathered outfit, which is a branch of the police. They were the most instrumental in rounding up the Jews and sending them to their demise. So about middle of April is when I was reunited with my parents. And it was kind of bittersweet. I was still very much, to this day, I'm missing Piroshka. Obviously, I was happy to see my parents, but I also must confess that the extended absence of my parents did not help a relationship I got somewhat estranged from my mother and father. Next frame, please. This is my grandfather, Joseph. I remember him as a wonderful human being, very intelligent. He spent a lot of time with me reading. He was very much a self-educated person, very successful, I might add. Didn't have any formal education, but I would put him up against almost anyone, and who would well-versed in literature, and they would find a worthy adversary in my grandfather. So that's basically the only thing that I would like to recount is my war experience, which was on one of the air raids in February of 45, when I was at my grandparents and we were hiding in the bunker. There was an air raid, and the apartment building next door to us took a direct hit, got totally destroyed, and everybody perished in that explosion. We just barely missed it, and that bomb could have easily missed by a few inches from release, and could have easily be hit our house, but thank God that didn't happen, and I'm here to speak with you. So like I said, that during one of these air raids, we came up, we heard the all clear, and we couldn't open the iron gate. Something was up against it. And eventually, after much yelling and screaming, somebody came to our aid and helped us with opening the door. And we came upon a scene that was utter carnage. Turns out that there were bodies stacked against the door of fallen soldiers, both German and Russian. And I clearly remember in the courtyard, there was a lineup of white camouflage Russian soldiers. And there were numerous bodies strewn all over the place. This was one of the bloodiest battles in Budapest between the fascists and the Red Army. Eventually, we were commandeered to take a trash cart that was in the vestibule, to take it and roll it out to the courtyard, or start piling bodies into the cart to take away. And my grandfather was always heads up, cautioned me not to take any German bodies because they are much better fed and much heavier than the Russians were, who were generally quite thin and skinny. And then we took them out to this plaza called Clausal Plaza. And basically we dumped them into a mass grave. One side for Russians and one side for Germans. And we did this trip several times. First time I was confronted with death. And it was a fairly traumatic experience, I'd add. So that's on one of our return trips, actually a lorry passed and they were throwing bread out from the lorry, and kids were running after the lorries to yelling on top of their lungs, chleba, chleba, which means bread in Russian. So I joined them and I managed to snare a loaf of bread, which was quite a treasure at that time. Hunger was an issue in Budapest at that time. So I got rewarded with a slice of bread by my grandparents for my heroics. That's about the size of my experience, my war experience and my Holocaust experience. Unfortunately, I don't sport a tattoo, so I haven't made it. I'm not a graduate on one of the camps, but I was exposed to mortal danger because some of these quote unquote safe houses were regularly raided by the fascists. And many children were taken, and adults for that matter. But by and large, the safe houses did save many thousands of Jewish people in Budapest. Next frame, please. Sorry. For some reason, whenever I get to this stage of my talk, I get very emotional upon seeing the portrait of Raoul Wallenberg. If you were to visit the Holocaust Museum in Los Angeles, the very first room exhibits the same, I'm not sure it's the same portrait, but it's similar, of Raoul Wallenberg, who in my own opinion is, and I may be opinionated, is the greatest humanitarian who perhaps ever lived, but certainly of the 20th century. And I owe my lot to this gentleman. So that's the reason I get overly emotional. And I can't seem to be able to stop getting emotional. But one of these days I grew up and I'll be able to be a little more objective. Next picture, next frame, please. Raoul Wallenberg, as a child on the left, his mother is May Wallenberg, and on the right is his father, Raoul Oscar Wallenberg, in his naval uniform. Raoul never got to meet his father. His father died at age 25, 2 months before Raoul's birth. He died of cancer. And so Raoul never had a real father. But the person who did, the mother had an emotional breakdown and could not care for Raoul upon his birth. So his grandfather, actually, who raised Raoul Wallenberg. Next frame, please. And these are just his pictures when he was 3 years old and at 16. So next picture, please. His grandfather's name was Gustav, and he was he was ambassador to Russia at one point. He was in St. Petersburg representing Sweden, and aside from that, he had a career in banking and shipping. The Wallenberg family itself is probably, well, one of the most powerful and wealthy families even today, if not the most powerful and wealthy families. I believe they are even today. And they were heavily involved in commerce, shipping, natural resources, mining, and above all, they were diplomats, a number of them, including Gustav, who had a diplomatic career besides his business career. This is just a little background on the Wallenberg family. The connection, and by the way, just briefly about Wallenberg, after he grew up, I mean, as he went to various universities. He attended, among others, the University of Michigan, or Michigan University, I forgot which. But he got a degree in architecture, and then he had a number of actually rather famous buildings that he was the architect in Sweden. Then he joined the diplomatic corps and spent time in Mexico and South America. And it was actually on a tour of Palestine that he became aware of the plight of the Jewish people in Europe and about the atrocities that are taking place when he was stationed in Jaffa or Haifa. Upon his return from Haifa, he went to work for a Hungarian expatriate named Lower Kalman, where he distinguished himself. And when Lower Kalman was approached by the War Refugee Board, namely a gentleman by the name of Ivar Olson, and the War Jewish Council to negotiate with Laurel Kalman and Wal Henrik, who was also in Sweden at the time, where he was stuck because of the war. He was an executive at the Weiss Manfred Works in Budapest, where he was a general manager. And so the two organizations and the two gentlemen, after negotiations, the purpose of the negotiations, of course, was the plight of the the remaining Jewish population in Budapest, and the desirability, the need to devise a plan of action to save what remains of the Jewish population, which was still considerable, approaching 250,000 Jewish souls. On July 1st, 1944, Per Unger was an attaché, and Carl Ivan Danielsson, the Swedish ambassador, requested a personal audience with the Governor Miklos Horthy of Hungary, and delivered a message from the King of Sweden. And I'm going to just show you a picture of the king. Hopefully you can see that. I don't know if you can give me feedback. That's King Gustav. So
Thank you. We saw the photo.
So King Gustav sent, and I just want to clarify something. It wasn't just Raoul Wallenberg, but the entire Swedish diplomatic corps, and all the way going up to the king, were on the same page on the desirability and the rescue of what's left of the Jewish population. So the king wrote a note to Horthy, advising him of the good name of Hungary and that the plight of the Jewish people of Hungary, and the suffering that took place up until then, and the necessity to save what remains of the Jewish population, and his request to act in his capacity as governor to save as many people as, and basically appealing to his good conscience and humanity to stop the carnage. The governor, up until now, has not been terribly, has not put up a big fight against the deportation of Jewish people, mainly from the countryside, but the deportations did not take place from Budapest by and large up until this point, but the countryside was pretty well cleared of all practically the entire Jewish population, with few exceptions. But it was a thorough sweep, and up until then, didn't seem to be too concerned. But by and large, he was not known to be an anti-Semite, and he wasn't necessarily a murderer. It's just that events got out of hand, and he just went along with the times. And the fashion, there was political issues between his factions and the fascists, and he was trying to keep them at bay and offer them a bone, which was basically what happened. Is the countryside got cleared, and the Budapest Jews were still safe. Eventually, in response to King Gustav's message, he replied that he'll do everything within his power, and he did. He pretty much sabotaged the Germans' efforts to continue with the deportations. The deportations slowed to a trickle, and this is roughly a week or so later, July 9th, when Raoul Wallenberg arrived in Budapest, and at least, there's a moment's peace as far as the clearing of the ghetto was concerned. And this is the environment he came into. And he came with a plan, which was to issue false documents to as many people as possible, to all applicants. And of course, everybody wanted this, and also to purchase real estate, apartment buildings mainly, where he could put up these protected people who were given protective papers, which are visas, passports, Schutzpasses, which are protected papers, which I'll show you an example of later on. And also, the other prong of his plan was to enlist the rest of the diplomatic community. Among those he was able to enlist was Karl Lutz, who was the Swiss ambassador. Ultimately, he was responsible for saving 62,000 Jewish lives through the use of 8,000 protected letters of safety. These 8,000 numbered letters were used and reused multiple times, starting with 1, ending with 8,000, and then restarting with 1 and ending with 8,000, on and on and on. So that was a clever way. He was only authorized to issue 8,000. He ended up saving 62,000 people's lives, plus 10,000 children who he organized a transport to safety. Aside from Karl Lutz, there was Carlos de Lis Tejera Bronquinho, of my pronunciation, please forgive me, of the Portuguese consulate. Angel Sans Brise, the Spanish minister responsible for saving 6,000 Jewish lives, ultimately received the Cross of Merit of the Republic of Hungary. Angelo wrote the Apostolic Nuncio of the Holy See, Giorgio Perlasca, the Swiss delegate of the International Red Cross, and last but not least, Shiun Sugihara of the Japanese mission issued visas, saving approximately 6,000 Jewish lives by issuing visas. Upon his return to Japan, he died in shame and abject poverty for his insubordination and involvement, and for his, in my opinion, heroism, but his master's opinion, his betrayal. At this point, I just want to show you what a Schutzpass is. It's an example, very official looking document. And that, by and large, was honored by the fascists because Sweden was a very necessary part of their war effort. If Sweden were to shut down Sweden was a major supplier of war material. And so they could not afford to rub them the wrong way, but at the same time, the Swedes themselves were ambivalent. I'm going to share a story with you on my experience in Stockholm. But I want to call your attention to a couple of events, minor events, that just show you the heroism that these gentlemen have undertaken. Besides, it's one thing to save people, but then it's another thing to keep them alive and to house them and feed them. And you're seeing a council here with Wallenberg. So he enlisted a lot of people's help in organizing the logistics of providing for these people, or they were put up in these safe houses, which was not an easy task. There was actually an unfortunate perception, and maybe a factual perception, that they did such a great job that people who were in these safe houses were very well fed, as opposed to the Hungarian population who were experiencing hunger, and that created resentment between the population and those who were in these safe houses. Some of the things that Wallenberg has done would be he would go out to the Obuda, which is the old Buddha side, and whenever transports would take off and taking the victims to their demise, destination Auschwitz, Birkenau, etc. He would go out and take some of the passengers off the train who possessed protective papers. Or on numerous occasions, the train would already left, and he would get in a car and get in front of the train, stand on the tracks, holding up one of these official train stop signs, and signs that manual stop signs that train workers use to stop a train, and hold it up, stop the train, and command that all those who possess protective papers, visas, etc., debark, and then he would take them back to Budapest. And he saved thousands of lives just by doing that. Another incident that happened in Budapest, and this is Karl Lutz. I'm going to read a story. Karl Lutz came upon Aerocross militiamen while they were firing at Jews on the banks of the Danube River. Lutz, this is the dead of winter, jumped into the Danube to save a bleeding Jewish woman along the quay that today bears his name, Karl Lutz, Rockport. We'll see a picture of it later. With water up to his neck, the consul swam back to the bank with the wounded woman, and to the astonishment of the firing squad and the Hungarian officer, declaring the wounded woman a foreign citizen protected by Switzerland, and quoting international covenants, the Swiss consul brought her back to his car in front of the stunned fascists, left quietly, fearing to shoot this tall man who seemed to be important and spoke so eloquently. No one dared to stop him, not to mention that they all recognized probably the heroism that just took place. This is just a little bit of what these two gentlemen, along with the others I mentioned, have done. On the next frame, please. This is Raoul Wallenberg on the left with his secretary, Mrs. Laszlo Falk. And on the right is his valet Vilmos Langfelder, who was a mechanical engineer, and also Raoul Wallenberg, chauffeur and valet. Next frame, please. Can we go on to the next frame? This is a picture of debarking passengers on who found their freedom. This is at the Josephville depot, who were freed and taken back to Budapest. Just a small example. of rescued people. Next frame, please. These three buildings just represent real estate that was purchased by Wallenberg and his associates. The one on the left is on Pozsonyi Avenue. The one on the right is Joseph Katona Street. And on the extreme right is a building which, interestingly, if you look on the upper left-hand corner, is one of the buildings, and this is on a street named after Wallenberg. So this is a picture taken shortly after the war, by which time the street was renamed Wallenberg Street. Next frame, please. As I mentioned earlier, this is Rolf Albertson, the Swedish ambassador, who was entirely devoted to the effort and did everything within his power, even at the darkest times, to help Raoul Wallenberg in his efforts. And on the right is Count Bernadette Folk of the Swedish Red Cross, the president of the Swedish Red Cross. Next frame, please. And now we come to my story, my visit to Stockholm. I went to Stockholm in 2010 for the World Master Swimming Championships in Göteborg, where did fairly well. And then, as long as I was in Sweden, I chose to pay homage to Raoul Wallenberg. I took a train to Stockholm, stayed at a hotel, and my first order of business was to find out where was the Raoul Wallenberg Memorial. And to my astonishment, I discovered that nobody seemed to know. The next day, I asked around. I still came up blank, and where I was walking around the city, and I went down to the great train, the central train station in Stockholm, and checking train schedules, among other things. And then on my way back, I came across this beautiful Lutheran church on top of a hill with a golden dome, and an announcement on the front door of a Bach concert that was about to start in about 30 minutes. Being a devotee of Bach, couldn't pass it by, and I went into the church and enjoyed a wonderful organ recital. Afterwards, I met the priest, or a minister. I think it's a minister. I correct myself on this. And he asked me what brought me to Stockholm, and I told him I'm looking for the Wallenberg Memorial, but so far I had no luck. Nobody seems to know where it is. This is before Waze or Google Map. So he invited me to the sequestery with a cup of coffee and a nice sandwich, smoked salmon sandwich. And then he says, let's go. He closed the church door, and talk about a fast walker. I could barely keep up with him. By the time we got to the park, I worked up a pretty good sweat. But there in front of me was the Wallenberg Memorial. And what is very significant to me is where this globe is sitting. If you notice, the globe is sitting on there are two rails. There's a rail spur on which it is sitting, or between two rails. And this rail spur actually leads into the building behind, which happens to be the Great Synagogue of Stockholm. And the rail spur actually leads into the courtyard of the great synagogue of Stockholm. Behind the globe, this concrete globe, is a sign that announces that this railroad spur was a gift from the Republic of Hungary. And what's significant about this railroad spur is that it was in the old Buda brickyards. It was in the brickyard where this is where it actually trains were sitting on these very rails in the brickyard, in which the unfortunate victims were packed into cattle cars to be transported to their demise at the various death camps, Auschwitz, Birkenau, etc. So you can imagine, to me, what an impact, what the significance of this, what it means. Next frame, please. The inscription just tells about the dangers of the escape, full of obstacles. I can't quite make out. It just talks about the escaping, and it's very subject. The whole memorial is very abstract and subjective, but it's in multiple languages, obviously. Next frame, please. And this is the in front, these figures representing escapees from the terror and certain extermination. Next frame, please. This is the rear of we're in Budapest now. This is the rear of the synagogue, of Synagogue Doheny. So happens I was bar mitzvah in this synagogue when I was a kid. Although it wasn't actually in the sanctuary because it was damaged. There's a building behind it, which is the Hungarian Jewish Council office building, and there's also an auditorium named after Karl Marx, Karl Marx, the composer, and that's actually where most of the services even today are being held, because the upkeep of the synagogue is, heating, air conditioning is very expensive, and unfortunately the participants numbers are very low, so it's more practical to hold services in the Goldmark auditorium. I dare say Karl Marx, Goldmark is the name. Next frame, please. This is a plaza behind the synagogue, named after Wallenberg, called Wallenberg Plaza. And this same area also, between the plaza and the synagogue, is an area of mass burials of victims of the Holocaust in Budapest between 1943 and 45. Next frame, please. As I mentioned to you about the story about Karl Lutz, about how he interceded and rescued a Jewish woman who was shot into the river. This was a regular practice by the Arrow Cross. Usually in their drunken stupor, they would bring people to the edge of the quay tie them together, and then they would perform acts of sportsmanship by shooting with one bullet as many victims as possible into the river. Great sports. Great sports. What's really significant here is that this part of the quay where the shoes are, these shoes were actually belonged to victims who were shot into the river. And the memorial is right below the parliament in Budapest. It's a stark reminder to politicians to never again. Next frame, please. And this is also in the Wallenberg Plaza. The Plaza of the Weeping Willows. Each leaf on this weeping willow signifies the inscribed, is actually the inscribed, contains the inscribed name of a Holocaust victim in Budapest. Next frame, please. And as you can see, there is examples of the inscriptions on the leaves that are on this tree. And next, I think that's the next frame, perhaps. And this is the facade of the synagogue Doheny, one of the grandest synagogues in the world. I understand it's the second largest synagogue in the world. I think it's the most, to me, it's the most beautiful synagogue in the world, but I may be prejudiced. I think that's the end of my graphic presentation. I just want to continue on with a couple of details about Raoul Wallenberg. On February 17, 1945, he was summoned to Debrecen, the city of Debrecen, the northeastern corner of Hungary, by Marshal Zhukov for a meeting, which ultimately turned out to be a kidnapping. Under murky circumstances not clarified until recently, when it was revealed that Wallenberg died of a heart attack in 1947 while in prison at Ljubljana prison in Moscow. There are rumors, not corroborated, that there were negotiations between the Russians and the Swedes about a ransom to release Wallenberg, and probably one of the motivations of kidnapping Wallenberg was the wealth of the Swedes. But neither the Swedes nor the Wallenberg family were willing to accede to blackmail. And so consequently, Raoul Wallenberg suffered a fatal heart attack. And I just want to, there are two things I still want to, I want to give you my conclusion on this part of my presentation. To give you a little perspective, Oskar Schindler saved less than 300 Jewish people under questionable conditions, working conditions, and living conditions. And then put that in comparison to Wallenberg's efforts and his team's effort, where they've saved more than 200,000 Jewish lives. Today, Schindler is revered. His gravesite is the most visited gravesite at Yad Vashem. Although all the gentlemen I mentioned have memorials on the Avenue of the Righteous at Yad Vashem, which is the ultimate Holocaust museum in Jerusalem. No one, whereas at Schindler, memorial pebbles are left on his grave, where it takes a special cart to haul away the daily memorials No such pebbles are left at any of these gentlemen's memorial. And no one, of course, nobody knows where Wallenberg's real resting place is. And I think I see Schindler is revered, whereas Wallenberg is fading from the public's memory and conscience. This is an injustice that must change. And it is my duty to bring back into focus the heroic deeds of the greatest humanitarian of the 20th century. That's in my opinion. And the third prong of my talk is, it goes back to, unfortunately, the unfortunate events that took place on January the 6th. There's no mistaking and there's no whitewashing that there were anti-Semitic chants during that event. There was anti-Semitic slogans bandied around, worn on T-shirts, Camp Auschwitz, etc. And that if there's one thing that keeps happening is that as far as history is concerned, is how it is repetitious, keeps repeating itself. And here in our midst, we're experiencing on a daily basis increased activities in anti-Semitism, or experiencing acts of anti-Semitism, which have been since January 6th have been increasing exponentially. So we are not, I think it's easy to understand how the German people became victim of the machinations of the fascists. And the parallels are uncanny what was happening in this country in January of 2021. I don't want to get too involved in the politics, but my personal opinion and conclusion is that the parallels are unmistakable, and we should be vigilant on not letting this happen again, and to make sure that it never happens again. And thank you for listening to my talk, and I'm ready, willing, and able, and happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us and for teaching about Raoul Wallenberg as you do on a regular basis. We appreciate everything that you do for our museum and our community by sharing this history. We do have a couple of questions. Let's see. First question that I have actually. This photograph here, did you take this photo?
Yes, yes.
What I'm wondering is, did you happen to have a conversation with this man sitting on the bench who appears to be drinking a beer? I'm wondering if, to your knowledge, if he was aware that he was sitting next to this monument.
Excellent question. And I was going to bring this up in my speech. I found the majority of Swedes either didn't know or didn't want to know about what Wallenberg has done. I actually visited the military museum in Stockholm, where there's a Wallenberg exhibit. And I had a talk with a docent. And he told me that many Swedes, there's ambivalence about what Wallenberg did. And that ambivalence lies in, unfortunately, pervasive anti-Semitism in Sweden itself. Not everybody in Sweden shared the magnanimity of Wallenberg and the people who he enlisted. there were a lot of Nazi sympathizers during this war, during the war years. And there is, even today, there is virulent anti-Semitism present in Sweden, to the extent that talking about Wallenberg's heroism does not endear the person who so chooses. So yes, there was a rude awakening to me. And as you could see, the gentleman drinking a beer right next to the memorial probably has no clue about what the memorial signifies.
Thank you for sharing. We do have some other questions. Can you please talk about what it was like after the war ended for you and your family in Hungary? And did you face anti-Semitism there from other Hungarians?
There was latent anti-Semitism. Obviously, people could not be open about it because it so happened that almost 100% of the Hungarian government, with one or two exceptions in leading positions, actually only one exception, they were all Jews who were, most of whom were either in prison or in Russia. And upon their return, they formed the government, and their loyalty was not with their brethren. Their loyalty was to Joseph Stalin in Moscow. And Joseph Stalin, being an anti-Semite himself, would not have approved if they would make Jewish lives easier. As a matter of fact, they made the lives of the remaining Jewish population, which by now was down to under 100,000 at the time I left Hungary, or thereabouts. So the Jewish people have really suffered under the communist rule. Take an example, my family, oral wealth was expropriated by the state. Economically, my parents struggled. My father could never, he had poor health, and all these, and he had anxiety issues that were exacerbated by the stories that were circulating among the Jewish population, beatings, arrests, beatings, and incarcerations on a regular basis. And of course, what was happening was the premier of Hungary, Matthias Rákosi, was Jewish, and that was very much on the minds of the rest of the non-Jewish population. So everything that was going wrong was blamed on Rákosi directly, but indirectly on Jews, period. So I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. Another question: was the Hungarian public aware during the German occupation of the various safe houses?
You see, the safe houses didn't come into being until after Raoul Wallenberg's arrival on July 9th, 1944. So I think they were, but I'm sure they were. I'm sure I read upon this, some of the histories. Raoul Wallenberg, among other things, has not just dealt with his colleagues. He also dealt with some of the Aerocross officials, without whose cooperation could not have happened in keeping at bay the invasions of the safe houses. So yes, there were actually cooperating Aerocross officials. There were some incredibly brutal ones, but there were those who cooperated with Wallenberg and in large measure contributed to the success of the safe houses. So given that the Aerocross was aware, I had to conclude that by and large, most of the population was, especially since practically all of these safe houses are flying flags of the various various countries, like Swiss, Portuguese, Spanish, etc.
Thank you.
With plaques, by the way, on the front door.
Thank you. So in that case, do you think that that would account for the very small number of Hungarians honored as righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem?
You're absolutely right. Hungarians were, by and large, outdoing each other in the persecution of Jews. They were Eichmann has, I'm quoting Eichmann, not the exact quote, but he considered the Hungarians the most helpful of all the nations in rounding up the Jews. So Jews could, in very rare instances, could rely on other Hungarians to hide them and give them safety. They would, in other words, by and large, they were unreliable.
Thank you. And also just to clarify, the Yad Vashem site shows that 734 have been honored compared with 867 from Italy, despite Italy's much smaller Jewish population. If we have any other questions, feel free to type it in the chat. In the meantime, can you please talk about when you came to California?
Well, in 1956, there was an uprising in Budapest. And when it started, I was actually in Slovakia at a water polo tournament. I was playing for the Hungarian youth team, and we had a tournament. So when the tournament ended, I arrived at the Eastern Terminal or depot in Budapest, and we came upon the Hungarian Revolution going full bore. So instead of going home, we went to the Republic Square in the 8th district to man the barricades. And I can't say that I was instrumental in the battles, because all I did was carrying guns to those who were actively involved in the fighting. But I was there, and I was interviewed on French television. And so when I came home, my father just advised me that, I told him what happened and why I was late and where I've been, and he told me that, and he correctly foretold that it's just a matter of time before the Russians will return, and they'd be looking for guys like me or kids like me, and there'll be retribution. So when that happened, with two friends. We took the world into our neck. We took a train from the same train depot, the Eastern train depot, and went west to near Sopron, between Sopron and Győr. We got off the train. We paid a farmer to lead us to the other side, which was Austria. And by then, the Russians were manning, the guards were manning the borders. So it was somewhat dangerous. And we managed to get to the other side of this little rivulet or brook. We forded it, and with bullets flying left and right. And all of a sudden I came across a policeman, and he introduced himself. Well, actually he said, "Welcome to Austria." And then went to this little town called Deutschkreuz, and eventually I ended up at Nellis Air Force Base in New Jersey, and then spent a few weeks with relatives in New York. Things didn't work out with them. So the highest, which was the Jewish Refugee Organization, placed with a family in Santa Monica. And that's how I arrived in California. And I stayed with them for a while until I could work and support myself. So that's the story of my arrival in California.
Thank you so much. We have several people who are watching just commenting and saying thank you for sharing your story. So one last question.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you to our audience. One last question. I know you mentioned this throughout the course of your talk or towards the end. Why do you share this story with people? And I'll actually preface it by specifically mentioning that you speak to students on a regular basis through our museum. You speak specifically to high school students a lot. Why do you do this? What would you like them to take away from learning this story?
Well, as I mentioned to you, I mean, as you said in my talk, I already mentioned that it is, this is the Schindler versus Wallenberg. Schindler is very much in the public conscience, but Wallenberg, whose accomplishments were truly extraordinary, are totally, I mean, it's almost nobody who you would go down the street and ask them if they ever heard of Raoul Wallenberg. Nobody, I yet have to find hardly anybody who have ever heard of him, or if they've heard of him, they don't know what he did or the extent of his heroism and his humanity. And it is my purpose to educate as many people as possible about what is the accomplishments of the greatest humanitarian, in my opinion. Somebody might argue with me, maybe Mother Teresa. No, I'll put Wallenberg and compare it to Mother Teresa or any of the other Nobel laureates, and who got recognition. And here's Wallenberg. In his own country, hasn't gotten the recognition. His own country is the site of where the Nobel Prizes are being presented. He has never been considered. This got to change. His deeds, he paid with his life for saving as many people as he has. At least his memory has to be celebrated and awarded.
Well, thank you so much for everything that you do for our community and for our future generations by sharing this story. We're so honored to have you as a part of our survivor community, somebody who is so active with our programs and to speak to students and general public and any other groups on a regular basis. Thank you so much for everything you do. And thank you very much to our audience for your questions. And you can actually check the chat right now, those watching on Zoom. You can check the chat to see some of our links to our upcoming programs. We will be continuing our virtual programs throughout the summer, and we are planning to reopen the museum relatively soon. And please stay posted on our website. Those of you who are also on our email list, if not, go to our website, contact us. We can add you to our email list. You can follow our upcoming programs, virtual and eventually in person. Thank you so much again, everybody, for your attention. Thank you, Stephen, and wishing you, everybody, a happy, healthy, and safe weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And again, you're getting thank you comments in the chat. So thank you so much.